Reprise de débat. The Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the Minister of Transport presented his vision for the future of transportation in Canada, also referred to as Transportation 2030. This vision reflects thorough consultation with Canadians, stakeholders, provinces and territories, Indigenous groups and academics, and following the release of the Canada Transportation Act's review, final report, also known as the Emerson Report. Transportation 2030 is made up of a series of initiatives under 5 themes: the traveler, safe transportation, green and innovative transportation, waterways, coasts, and the north, and trade corridors to global markets. These themes encompass various modes of transport and allow the government to take a holistic approach in ensuring the transportation system is equipped to support our broader priorities. Canadian travelers and their experiences are top of mind for our government. During consultations conducted by the Minister of Transport, we asked Canadian travelers for their feedback, and they were clear. They want lower-cost air travel, more opportunities for leisure and business travel, and they want to see Canada become a more attractive travel destination for visitors. Canadians told us that they want long-term, sustainable competition, which will allow for the introduction of additional air services, improved air connectivity, and more choice. The government has listened, and it is committed to achieving tangible improvements to the traveler experience. As a result of the feedback we received, a number of proposals have been introduced in Bill C-49 to help improve the traveler experience. For example, the government intends to liberalize international ownership restrictions for Canadian air carriers. What does this mean for Canadian travelers? Allow me to briefly describe this initiative. The legislation proposes to liberalize international ownership restrictions from 25 to 49% for Canadian air carriers, with associated safeguards. For example, a single international investor would not be able to hold more than 25% of the voting interests of a Canadian air carrier, and no combination of international air carriers could own more than 25% of a Canadian carrier. The policy change would not apply to Canadian specialty air services such as aerial photography or firefighting, which would retain international ownership levels at 25%. Liberalizing international ownership restrictions means Canadian air carriers, and this includes all passenger and cargo providers, would have access to more investment capital that they can use for innovation. This would bring more competition into the Canadian air sector, providing more choice for Canadians and generating benefits for airports and suppliers, including...
Order. The Honourable Member for Huron-Bruce on a point of order.
We've lost quorum, Mr. Speaker. I think if you check, you'll find we've lost quorum.
Okay. Thank the Honourable Member for bringing this to attention, and I'll begin to count. Indeed, we do not have quorum, so I'll ask that the bells be rung. Okay, quorum has been reconstituted, and we will carry on with the debate. And the Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in the fall of 2016, the Minister of Transport exempted from the ownership restrictions of 25% to 2 companies that wanted to enter the Canadian market, supported by increased foreign investment. This decision is now permitting Enerjet and Jetlines to pursue their intention to create a low-cost carrier service to Canadians. By liberalizing the foreign investment provisions, Canadians will have more frequent access to air travel within Canada and from Canada to trans-border and international locations. Like most countries, Canada limits international ownership and control of domestic air carriers. As I mentioned, under the Canada Transportation Act, non-Canadians currently cannot possess more than 25% of the voting shares of a Canadian carrier. Additionally, Canadian air carriers must also be controlled by Canadians. which means they may not be subject to controlling influence by international investors. Limits on foreign ownership and control of air carriers are the norm around the world. For example, in the United States, the limit is 25%, while in Europe, the European Union, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand allow up to 49%, and Japan allows 33.3%. Limits vary depending on the circumstance of each region. However, Canada's current ownership limits may be acting as a barrier to new services and enhanced competition. Earlier, I mentioned that the two prospective ultra-low-cost carriers, Canada Jetlines and Enerjet, have already applied for and received exemptions to the current limits on international ownership from the Minister of Transport. This was granted because both companies successfully argued that under the current 25% limit, there is insufficient risk capital in the Canadian market to support the launch of new services. Reflecting on this reality and the Canada Transportation Act review recommendations, the government is proposing changes which would allow international investors to own up to 49% of the voting shares of Canadian air carriers by introducing legislation that would amend the Act and other relevant acts. As mentioned earlier, countries have different approaches to international ownership of air carriers, and our government wants to make sure that Canadian air carriers compete on a level and even playing field. To protect the competitiveness of our air sector and support connectivity, no single international investor or any combination of international air carriers would be allowed to own more than 25%. But how will this benefit Canadian travelers? The direct impact of higher levels of international investment is that Canadian air carriers would have access to a wider pool of risk capital. This would allow air carriers to be better funded and could allow new carriers, which are otherwise not able to find sufficient risk capital, to enter the Canadian market. New carriers, including ultra-low-cost carriers, offering extremely competitive prices, are expected to bring more competition into the entire Canadian air travel sector. This could in turn reduce the cost of air transportation and open new markets to Canadian consumers and shippers. Small markets currently underserved by existing carriers could also benefit from services by new carriers. For example, airports in smaller cities that currently offer services to a very limited number of destinations could benefit from the addition of new services, since we know that ultra-low-cost carriers use these smaller airports as their hubs. All of this could lead to more choice when purchasing an airline ticket, more travel destinations for all travelers, including those from smaller cities, and lower prices for Canadian travelers. Additionally, there could also be benefits for airports and suppliers, and the entire country as more jobs are added to the Canadian economy. Another improvement to the air travel sector in this bill is that it proposes a new transparent and predictable process for the authorization of joint ventures between air carriers, taking into account competition and wider public interest considerations. Joint ventures are a common practice in the global air transport sector. They enable two or more air carriers to coordinate functions on specific routes, including scheduling, pricing, revenue management, and marketing and sales. In Canada, air carrier joint ventures are currently examined from the perspective of possible harm to competition by the Competition Bureau under the Competition Act. Unlike many other countries, notably the United States, Canada's current approach does not allow for the consideration of the wider public interest benefits other than competition and economic impacts. Furthermore, the Bureau's review is not subject to specific timelines. This raises concerns that the current approach to assessing joint ventures may make Canadian carriers less attractive to global counterparts as joint venture partners, and may be limiting the ability of Canadian carriers to engage in this industry trend. The bill that is before you in this House proposes amendments that would allow the Minister to consider and approve air carrier joint ventures, taking into account competition considerations. On this latter concern, this Minister would work in close consultation with the Commissioner of Competition to ensure that he is properly informed regarding any concerns that he or she may have with regard to competition. Air carriers that would choose to have their proposed joint ventures assessed through the new process would be given clear timelines for an expected decision. Providing Canada's air carriers with such a tool would also benefit the air traveler. By joining up networks, air carriers could allow seamless travel to a wide range of destinations and reduce the duplication of functions. For Canadians, this could mean more seamless access to key global markets, easier inbound travel in support of tourism and business, as well as an increasing transiting traffic through our airports, thus increasing flight options. Globally, airports are making unprecedented investments in passenger screening to facilitate passenger travel and gain global economic advantages. Canada's largest airports have expressed an interest in making significant investments in passenger screening, either through additional workforce or technology innovation. And smaller airports have shown interest in obtaining access to screening services to promote local economic development. In the last 2 years alone, 10 small airports across Canada have requested screening services. The proposed amendments to the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority Act are important as they would create a more flexible framework to allow CATSA to provide these services on a cost recovery basis, which would in turn allow Canada to maintain an aviation system that is both secure and cost-effective. In turn, this would support our efforts to maintain an aviation system that is both secure and cost-effective. It would also strengthen Canadian communities' competitiveness, and they attract new commercial routes. But, Mr. Speaker, that's not all the Transportation Modernization Act does. Bill C-49 proposes to mandate the Canadian Transportation Agency to develop, in partnership with Transport Canada, new regulations to enhance Canada's air passenger rights. These new rules would ensure air passenger rights are clear, consistent, and fair for both travelers and air carriers. When passengers purchase an airline ticket, they expect and deserve that the airline will fulfill its part of the transaction. When that agreement is not fulfilled, passengers deserve clear, transparent, and enforceable standards of treatment and compensation for such situations. Now, under this proposed legislation, Canadians would benefit from a uniform, predictable, and reasonable approach. The details of the new approach would be elaborated through the regulatory process that would include consultations with Canadians and the air stakeholders. My objective is to ensure that Canadians have a clear understanding of their rights as air travelers without negatively impacting on access to air services and cost of air travel for Canadians. Bill C-49 specifies that the regulations would include provisions regarding the following most frequently experienced irritants: providing passengers with plain language information about carriers' obligation and how to seek compensation or file complaints, setting standards for the treatment of passengers in the case of overbooking, delays, and cancellations, including compensation, standardizing compensation levels for lost or damaged baggage, establishing standards for the treatment of passengers in the case of tarmac delays over a certain period of time, seating children close to a parent or guardian at no extra charge, and requiring air carriers to develop standards for transporting musical instruments. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has been clear that he intends for the regulations to include provisions ensuring that no Canadian is involuntarily removed from an aircraft due to overbooking after they have boarded. The Minister has issued a challenge to Canada's air carriers on this matter, and that of seating arrangements for minors, that they move to strengthen air practices even before new passenger rights are finalized. This bill also proposes that data could be required from all parties in the air sector to be able to monitor the air traveler experience, including compliance with the proposed passenger rights approach. This data would also inform any future policy or regulatory actions that would be taken by the Minister of Transport to ensure the air traveler experience to, within, and out of Canada is efficient and effective. To finish, let me underscore that the experience of Canadian air travelers is of greater priority for the Government of Canada. We know that it is also a priority for Canadians. This is why we have proposed to increase international ownership restrictions for Canadian carriers. It's why we're proposing new rules on joint ventures that would help create greater efficiencies and more choices for Canadian travelers. It's why we're proposing some modest changes to the provisions of CATSA screening services that should help air passengers and transit through airports more quickly. And finally, it's why we're creating a legislative framework so Canadians can finally benefit from an air traveler's Bill of Rights. Mr. Speaker, once these new measures are in place, it could help lower prices, support increased competition among air carriers, and provide more choice to Canadians when it comes to purchasing a ticket, and improve service and connectivity for all Canadians and Canadian travelers. Thank you.